Good day or good evening to you, wherever you're watching. Thanks for joining us here on France 24. This is Eye on Africa. These are our main stories. The Global South widely condemns the war in Iran, with many countries accusing the US and Israel of violating international law and acting unilaterally. In this program, we'll discuss the growing frustration among developing nations about how power conflicts affect global stability and how the conflict is directly impacting Africa. And the United States imposes sanctions on the Rwandan army and several top military officials over their role in fighting in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. The US Treasury Department said Kigali's armed forces played a pivotal role in a lightning rebel offensive last year. Rwanda rejects allegations by the US and the UN that it backs rebel groups in DRC. Thanks very much for joining us. First up, the Global South has widely condemned the US and Israel's war in Iran, with many countries criticizing the assassination of the leader of a sovereign state. Several nations, including in Africa, say the airstrikes are a violation of international law, accusing the US and Israel of waging a war of aggression and acting unilaterally without UN Security Council approval. It reflects the growing frustration among developing nations about how power conflicts affect global stability, one impact of which has been felt immediately, with Iran closing the Strait of Hormuz, through which a fifth of global oil exports pass. Let's talk more now about how the war in Iran is directly affecting Africa. I'm very pleased to introduce Menzi Ndlovu, Senior Country Risk Analyst at the Signal Risk Intelligence firm, joining us from Johannesburg. So great to have you along. It's difficult to try to condense this into just a few examples in just a few minutes, but let's start with the immediate economic consequences with the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. What sort of impacts has this had, and which regions will be most affected?
It's a pleasure to be joining you this evening on what is quite a troubling topic. So the immediate impact that we have seen is on fuel prices. Your guest earlier on mentioned that energy prices, or specifically oil, has gone up by north of 5%. Here in Africa, we're seeing an increase north of around 8%. We've also seen gas prices go up, and that for Africa raises a concern around inflation. We know that a number of African countries, despite being well endowed with oil resources, are actually energy importers. And as a result of that, they are heavily exposed to fluctuating oil prices. And this creates a substantial inflationary risk just when African countries were actually returning to pre-pandemic levels of inflation. And the further risk there is that we risk undercutting our cutting cycle. So a number of African countries were poised to reduce their interest rates in order to stimulate growth. Now, with these inflationary risks arising due to what's happening in the Middle East, we are at a point where we might have to stop our cutting cycle and institute interest rate increases, which will in turn undermine economic growth expectations, which, dare I say, were relatively positive up until this juncture. So that is the major concern at the moment. There are other secondary risks that we're looking at, such as currency depreciation and portfolio outflows. We have seen here in South Africa the rand take a bit of a knock. The mighty rand, which had been one of the best performing currencies against the US of late, it's taken about a 3% knock, and that is a concern. We've also seen a degree of portfolio outflows. Yields for South African government bonds have gone up by around 10 basis points since the launch of the conflict, and that's a concern for South Africa as well. And broader data is showing that the past few days have arguably been amongst the worst for emerging markets since 2024. And that is a concern once again for debt acquisition, for debt repayments, which we know is a major obligation for a number of African countries, and also for spending plans. Due to depreciation, due to costly debt, African governments might find themselves in a situation where they have to alter fiscal plans and reprioritize some of their spending towards higher repayments. And we know that when we get to this juncture, it's developmental spending, the one that matters most to the person of the ground, that gets sacrificed. And it's no specific African country that is vulnerable. All of us are vulnerable to all of these economic risks. That's why we're looking at this situation intently and hoping for a swift resolution.
Menzi, you give us a great overview of the economic situation there. The US and Israel, they're talking about regime change in Iran and suggesting this could last for much longer. How could this shape security and geopolitics in Africa?
Yeah, so fortunately, Africa has been largely immune to the security risks in the short term, but this doesn't necessarily mean that we are immune in the long term. And that's primarily due to the fact that we have probable targets for Iran and Iranian proxies. Right, those being American bases in Djibouti, Israeli interests in Somaliland and Eritrea. Saudi Arabia also has a base in Djibouti, and the UAE has a lot of interest in Somaliland. And so if the conflict continues and Iran and its proxies, such as the Houthis, decide to expand their scope of targets, it's highly probable that each of these interests might be targeted. And these are less defended than others, such as military bases in the Middle East. So that is the primary security concern. The secondary one, I would argue, is the shift in dynamics where some of the players in the conflict are actually preeminent. So situations like Sudan, which in many ways is somewhat of a proxy war between Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Now, in some senses, they have been spoilers. But in another sense, there have been a balancing factors, and they have prevented the conflict from escalating to a degree that's largely uncontrollable. So if these two parties have to reprioritize their national security interests and focus on Iran and thereby withdraw their focus on Sudan, we might find ourselves with an unfortunate situation there. And then we also know that Iran has proxy interests across a number of states in Africa, specifically Nigeria, Tanzania, and other areas in North Africa. Now, we've seen some protests in Nigeria by a group called the Islamic Movement of Nigeria in response to the killing of the Ayatollah. Now, historically, they've been largely passive, but they have engaged in acts of violence before. If the conflict, again, is prolonged, and Iran decides to mobilize some of its proxies, specifically in Nigeria, we can see an uptick in unrest akin to what we're seeing in Pakistan and possibly even worse. And a similar situation might arise in Tanzania as well, where there are strong pro-Iranian groups as well. So that is the security outlook. All right. Geopolitically, Africa finds itself in a bit of a tense moment, especially the members of BRICS, such as South Africa, such as Ethiopia, such as Egypt. But I'd say more so South Africa, which has been the most proximate party to Iran. And if the conflict continues, they might be under much more pressure to choose sides between BRICS and the West. And South Africa in particular will find itself in a particularly awkward position because it has fallen afoul of the West. And if it does make a misstep in this juncture, it can potentially find itself under more scrutiny and possibly more penal measures by the West, which has been fairly hawkish towards South Africa. But for
Menzi,
other
I'd love
African
to
countries,
discuss in more detail. There are so many elements that we haven't yet touched on, but we do have to end it there. Menzi Ndlovu, Senior Country Risk Analyst at Signal Risk Intelligence Firm. Thank you very much for joining us tonight.
are you?
Well, next up to South Sudan, where around 170 people have been killed in an attack on a remote village in the northern Abyemnon county. Local Information Minister James Moniluak said women and children were among the dead, as well as dozens of fighters. No group has claimed responsibility so far, but initial reports indicate the raid was carried out by an ethnic Nuer group, potentially a retaliation attack. It's the latest in a growing trend of violence in the world's youngest nation, where the United Nations has warned of a return to all-out civil war as a power-sharing deal between President Salva Kiir and his longtime rival Riek Machar has unraveled over the past year. Thanks. The United States has imposed sanctions on the Rwandan army as well as top military officials over their role in fighting in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. Kigali has long rejected allegations by Kinshasa. The United Nations and Western powers, that it backs rebels in the mineral-rich east of DRC. But the US Treasury Department said on Monday that Rwanda's forces had played a pivotal role in a lightning offensive last year that saw rebels take control of more territory than ever before. The government in Kinshasa hailed Washington's move, but as our correspondent Emmett Livingston tells us, the effects of the sanctions will take some time to be felt on the ground.
This is a momentous move. In practice, it means that the Rwandan army can no longer transact in dollars. This effectively cuts it off from most of the global financial system. The US said it was sanctioning Rwanda's army for supporting the M23 rebels, and that the rebels' gains wouldn't have been possible without Rwandan backing. Washington also said that Rwanda's support had enabled horrific human rights abuses. Rwanda reacted by calling the sanctions one-sided, arguing that it's Congo which hasn't respected the peace deal. But in Congo, government officials were jubilant. The government spokesman stated that the country was deeply grateful, and the foreign minister called the sanctions a turning point. The hope is that these sanctions will now tip the balance on the battlefield, where the conflict is still continuing. Over the weekend, according to security sources, M23 rebels launched at least 4 drones towards the airport in the northern Congolese city of Kisangani, which were all shot down. And in the provinces of North Kivu and South Kivu over the past few days, fighting has been intense, with government forces and rebels vying for control over several different territories.
Finally, Burundi has nominated the former Senegalese President Macky Sall as a candidate to become the next United Nations Secretary General. Sall's nomination has stirred controversy. In his home country, the current government in Dakar accusing him of covering up unfavourable economic data from 2012 to 2024. Burundi, the current chair of the African Union, hailed Sall's fight, particularly as president of the AU, to carry Africa's voice within international bodies. 2 other candidates have been formally nominated, the former Chilean President Michelle Bachelet and Argentine diplomat Rafael Grossi, who heads the International Atomic Energy Agency. Antonio Guterres' second term as UN chief ends in December. The selection process of his replacement is due to begin around July. And that's it for this edition of Eye on Africa. Do stay with us here on France 24. Coming up at the top of the hour, the international headlines.